I would like to introduce John Lamb. John, start walking up here. By the time you get up here, your introduction will be done. John is Professor Emeritus at the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate at the University of Minnesota. And it was in 2005 or 15 rather at the nitrogen conference in St. Cloud, John surprised us with the announcement that he was going to retire. Just on a personal note, John and I both live in the city of Woodbury, which is kind of an upscale city, and you wouldn't expect people like John or I to live there by any means. And John always joked about putting a John Deere tractor in his front yard just to see what his neighbors would respond to. So we're very fortunate to have John come out of retirement and talk a little bit about some of the sugar beet research. And so his talk today is nitrogen management for sugar beets. So please welcome John Lamb.
Okay, well, I am the redneck in my neighborhood, all right? And my wife, I have a lawnmower, riding lawnmower. And, you know, I lost the hood off of it and I drove that thing for a couple of years and I had a couple of neighbors that didn't think that was too great, but it ran great. So we're going to get started today talking about nitrogen management on sugar beets. All right. I've talked about this thing since I was just a little guy. I started working in sugar beets in 1980 when I was a graduate student. They needed somebody to follow the lifter out at Scotts Bluff. And so we would take a week off before the World Series and go out and lift beets. Then I moved up to Crookston. I started at Crookston in 1984. Crookston is the home to our sugar beet project with the U of M. And so I kind of just got into that. And then finally, I moved down to the Twin Cities to work on a water quality project. And damn sugar beets kept calling again. And so I worked a lot with, we have three cooperatives in the state of Minnesota, American Crystal Sugar, Mindak Sugar, or Mindak Co-op, actually, Farmers Co-op, and Southern Minnesota Beet Sugar out of Renville. Sugar beets supply about half of the sugar in the United States. And we grow in Minnesota about a quarter of the sugar. So not to say sugar isn't important to Minnesota is kind of an understatement, I think. It's very important and it's been very good to me, okay? So we'll get started here. High tech here. All right. So the key to nitrogen management in about every crop is, if you don't hear this word nitrogen cycle more today, I'll be disappointed in the conference, okay? It all comes down to the nitrogen cycle. What affects some of those things that are going on there is the climate, the soil type, the crop grown affects how that management works. And when we're looking at a specific crop, the previous history of the field, such as its fertilizer history, manure history, and previous crop. So I'm going to start right up front. What the heck do we suggest? And by we, I mean the University of Minnesota and NDSU. We suggest that you use a soil nitrate test to a depth of 4 feet. I can hear the groans if you've taken a 4-footer. That's just the way it is. Select a field with less than 150 pounds of soil nitrate in the top 4 feet. And you'll learn why that's important in a little bit. We also are selecting a field based on the previous crop. Sugar beet quality is best when you follow small grains, then soybean, then corn, and then finally alfalfa. If you follow alfalfa, your chances of raising a quality crop is very close to zero, okay? And this is work that's been done both up in the Red River Valley and in the southern Minnesota beet sugar growing area. We also say you shouldn't over fertilize the crops in the rotation, because what happens is you're left with a residual nitrate that is something that you cannot deal with. Once you have it, it's hard to correct for it. You've already lost the game at producing a high yielding, high quality sugar beet. And finally, do not apply manure more than once in the 3-year rotation for the same reason. And I'll talk about manure in a little bit, but basically manure is the gift that keeps on giving. And for most crops, that's wonderful. It's a wonderful nutrient source. But when we're looking at quality in sugar beets, that's not so good. So what are our current recommendations? 110 to 150 pounds of fertilizer plus soil test per acre in the southern mint growing area. In the Mindac and crystal sugar area, 130 with a 4-foot soil test. And if you don't do the 4-foot, 110 pounds. And it's a little bit different than what we look at for corn. We use the soil test plus fertilizer equal. The fertilizer end, we're assuming that you're following best management practice. In other words, you're going to put on the right source at the right time at the right rate and so on. In beets, it's a little bit different than corn. Fall or spring pre-plant applications on a heavy non-irrigated soil works well. Split end applications, they're okay, but there's no advantage to them. Unlike in corn where we talk more about split end applications, in sugar beets, we have not seen an advantage one way or the other. And then we want to use manure at conservative rates. One other thing, following sugar beets, you also have to beware of some issues. In the Red River Valley, they found that those tops have a lot of nitrogen in them, and it breaks down fairly fast. So they give credit if you're growing like wheat after sugar beets based on how green the tops were. And so there's a credit. We've done that work in southern Minnesota, and we do not see that. And it's not because we don't grow green grass, green tops there either. The system's a little bit different. And also, if you're growing corn after sugar beets, sugar beet doesn't host mycorrhizae, and therefore you must use some zinc and phosphorus as a starter to get a good corn crop out of it. In fact, we recommend that if you can, grow soybeans afterwards. So that, if you're just here to know what we're doing for recommendations, you can leave now. There's still a lot of rolls and a lot of coffee and stuff. But now I'm going to go in and tell you why those recommendations are. We've been very fortunate in the industry. We have this thing called a checkoff. All the co-ops have checkoffs on the acreage, and all of our sugar companies are cooperatives, so they're farmer owned. And so the important part of that is, yes, growing a good quality crop is good for the grower, but a good quality crop to go into the refiner pays them too, because the higher the sugar in it and the less impurities in it makes it cheaper to get the sugar out of the beet. And if it's cheaper and more efficient, there's more money that comes back into the owner's pockets or the cooperatives. So sugar beet, it's a biennial crop, so it's a little bit different than corn. You know, sugar beet, the first year you grow it, and that's what we do here in Minnesota. We grow it for the root and for the sugar. Now, it grows the second year for seed. That is done out in Oregon in the Willamette Valley. They need a cold period, and then they come and they bolt and they raise seed the second year. And so it's a little bit different that way. The sugar beet's main job is to capture light and make sugar out of it. That's its main job. And so our goal with our fertility program, but particularly nitrogen, is to decrease the time it takes to get to full canopy. Because full canopy means you're capturing all of the light you can, and then life is good. And in fact, what we've found over the years in principle is get it to the canopy after July 1, particularly, 6 weeks before harvest, we want it to go deficient because we don't want to put that energy into leaves. We want it to put that sucrose down in the root. If you get a situation where you stimulate the growth of the leaves, you're stealing sugar from the root. Now, Mother Nature plays a big role in this. You know, if we go into a drought, we do pretty good because the plant kind of shuts down. But if we've come from a drought and then all of a sudden we get rain, the root says, hey, I'm going to grow. And then we have mineralization occur out of the organic matter, so there's nitrogen there. And so ruins the quality. So it's a little trickier growing sugar beets. The other thing about a sugar beet, we don't care about the tops once the canopy's full. The root is the important thing. And I don't know if this thing's got a pointer on it or not, but anyhow, there's a picture there of a root. And you can see that's only about a 6 to 8 leaf beet. Okay? There's a young guy out at Amalgamated Sugar that did this picture. And I want to make sure he got credit for that. That root goes down 4 feet right there. We have instances that we've documented that by the end of June, that root is down to 4 feet. And by the end of the season, it'll be 8 to 10 feet. And what it does, it loves water. It gets water. And with the water, it gets any soil nitrate and it takes it in. And the beet loves to take up nitrate. And so the root is important. It's important also because that's what we're harvesting for the sucrose. So you can have a crappy top growth and still have a very good sugar crop. So let's talk about a little bit to compare it to corn. By the way, most sugar growers grow corn. All right, it's in the rotation. Corn yield productivity is not hurt by over application of nitrogen, the productivity. Now the profit can be because you're losing money because you put too much N on, and you put too much on, and you can cause problems to the environment because it has nowhere to go. So it sits there as residual nitrate, and if you got a good rain, it's gone. Now, sugar beet productivity or our end product can be hurt by over application. Too much N lowers the amount of sugar that's stored in the beet. Okay? So you don't have a beet that has 16, 17% sucrose in it. You may have a beet that has 14, 15% sucrose in it. The other thing is nitrogen is an impurity in the refining process. So on top of not having as much to begin with, you've got that impurity in there, and it makes it harder to get the sugar out of the beet. And so you usually end up with more molasses, which molasses is worth something, but it's not worth what sugar is. And in Minnesota, the grower is paid for extractable sucrose per acre. They are not paid for root yield. Okay? So that is the intricacies of the payment system, which, by the way, is an industry secret. I've never, but basically there's numbers in there to affect the efficiency of the extraction. Some co-ops actually charge you on a per ton basis for refining. So the idea of raising more tons to beat the system is a lot harder in some co-ops than in others. The idea, again, like I say, is to get the row closer, and then 6 weeks before harvest, go deficient. And that's hard to do in Minnesota with our high organic matter soils. Where does the N come from? We have to look into this in depth. Where's that nitrogen coming from? Well, we have soil mineralization, and in Minnesota with we've got some really nice soils with high organic matters. I grew up in Nebraska. If we saw 2% organic matter, well, at that time I was too young to understand it, but we would do turn wheels, you know. We'd drive through, all our soils are buff colored instead of that dark color that you see in Iowa and Minnesota. We also, that gets it from residual soil nitrate that's sitting there and from fertilizer and or manure. So kind of a neat thing that Al Sims, myself, Mark Bredehoff, and Chris Dunsmore did back in I think it was 2009, 2010, we went out and put some cores out in these sugar beet fields, intact cores that saw the same temperatures and moisture regimes that the soil would see. Sorry about that. We put those in there, and then we would extract them over time to see what the mineralization was in those tubes. And we came up with this neat little graph. On the bottom line, we have percent organic matter. And on the vertical axis, we have the amount of N that actually was mineralized out. And so if you get in that 4 to 5% organic matter, we can count on somewhere between 40 and 100 pounds of N through mineralization. And it's significant. So it is something that we have to beware of. Okay? So we can kind of put that together. Say we get 70 pounds for mineralization. And our residual nitrates can run anywhere from 40 to 100. Actually, they can run up to 300 some years, and that's not a good thing. So you already got 170 pounds of N already there for the crop that utilizes somewhere between 225 and 250 pounds, 250 pounds of nitrogen. So it all adds up. So we have to manage those things. So now, kind of going to revert into the little bit about the management, and I'm going to kind of follow the 4R routine. You've never heard of 4Rs, right? We call them BMPs back in the old days. But anyhow, the most useful tool that we have for rate is that soil nitrate test to a depth of 4 feet. That's the most useful tool. We've tried other things. We've tried, you know, using organic matter. We've tried using, you know, putting all this together, and the soil nitrate test is what comes out and is a useful tool. So again, I keep saying this, but the excess N isn't economically a problem for the co-op. We don't have expected yields in sugar beet production because expected yields used to be used for kind of to measure the management and how crappy your soils were. Yes, that's the term, crappy soils. And you guys just aren't very awake yet this morning, huh? So anyhow, most sugar beets, first of all, most Minnesota soils are great soils. We're very fortunate. And most sugar beets are grown on that kind of soil. Now, we have some that are in sandy soils, but they are irrigated to make up for that. And so no yield goal is used, and we've kind of gone to that in our corn recommendations since then. Sugar beet, I want to tell you, is a nitrate nitrogen pig. If there's a drop of nitrate in the soil, it will find it. And that's the reason why quality is a tough thing to get. So just to give you an idea of what goes on, this is a study from 2011, and we have 4 graphs there. First one is the root yield, and I'm sorry about the rudimentary graphics, but I just didn't have time to run a regression on them and make them look pretty for you. You know, when you're retired, coffee is an important component of your daily job. So you can see root yield responded to N at this site, and then it kind of flitters all over. If you ran a quadratic plateau on it, it plateaus up there. The other thing I want to show you is in the upper right-hand corner, you have extractable sucrose, and that's in pounds per ton. That's a quality parameter. And you can see the minute we start adding nitrogen to this system, the percent sugar goes down. Then you combine those two with an equation to combine the two, and you get extractable sucrose. And you can see that it maximizes out a little bit lower end than what root yield does. So they're both effective. And depending on how the payment scale is, it can affect it one way or the other even more. But that's how the basics of figuring out how much sugar you're growing works from an agronomic standpoint. So we've got these recommendations, and everybody says, well, that's from small plot data, okay? Well, back in 2003, when I was still young and could walk all day, and that we went out in a couple growers' fields, we put strips on, and then we went out and did yields out in those strips when everything was done. And from this graph, I hope this works. You can see from this graph, this is soil nitrate to 4 foot plus fertilizer, extractable sucrose in pounds per acre. And you can see basically from about 110 or so, she just goes downhill. Slowly, but downhill. And if you're putting nitrogen fertilizer on, you're losing money that way too. Now, I'm going to show you the case for not expected yields. I graphed up some of our early stuff when I was putting the recommendations together, and you just get a mess like this. There's no matter, you know, what your yield is. Like for instance, we're up here about 30 tons, and back then that was a good yield, okay? And you say, well, we didn't even get a response to nitrogen at that site. Down here, lower yields will get a good response, but their yield and nitrogen rate are not related in sugar beets. So that's why they're gone. It's been gone a long time. Here's our original data that we put the recommendations together. And what's interesting, I did this with data from all of the co-ops, and they come out at that time, they came out very similar, okay? And this is relative return based on, this is on the payment system for Southern Mint at the time. And you can see we get a good response in payment up to about 110 pounds of fertilizer plus soil test. And it's flat till out about 150. And then that quality starts to, and you can also see my mathematics aren't strong enough to catch the downhill side right. But you can see it goes downhill. So we have what we call a sweet spot between 110 and 150. So however, you know, we tell the growers that's where we'd like it, okay? Now, you can say, well, John, that's old data. What about the new data? Well, every year we're doing something in the different co-ops with nitrogen rate to buck that up. And this is from 2021. And we fitted, so we used some corn economics on it, you might say. And we basically found that in these two locations that our ENOR in Lorenville was 112 pounds, and at the Hector site, it was 90 pounds. And we grew 12,000 pounds of sugar that year, which is a good yield even now, and almost 10,000. So our recommendations, when we get a response, our recommendations are really good, or as good as they can be. So now let's talk about the right form. Are there any questions yet? Good, I've baffled you with bullshit. So the right form, if applied correctly, following the BMPs, we don't see much difference in what form you use. Now BMPs, if you're using UAN, you've got to do something to make sure that you aren't having volatilization problems. If you're using urea, you have to do something that shows that you aren't having volatilization problems. If you're using anhydrous, you want to make sure you get it covered up. Now, I'm old enough to remember what anhydrous was and then when it was the big dog in the house, but most of the growers are starting to use mainly urea. And so we have to be particularly careful with that. And one thing we have found is when you use in the spring application, you use urea and you put it, work it in and then go plant, we have some problems with stand issues at the higher rates of urea. And I'll show you some of that data. So we have to be aware of that. We suggest split applications on sandy irrigated soil. I think that's that makes sense. I mean, your sands, you got leaching issues, you're adding more water to it. It's just, we've got data that, early data that says that's the way to go. At the time of this talk, we have not found a silver bullet in our nitrogen, improved nitrogen efficiency products yet. And we're testing those every year. We had a couple out last year, didn't do anything, okay? So you can throw darts at me from the industry, but that's, as I put the disclaimer as of this talk. And then manure and organic sources are a different matter. They're just, it's a whole nother ballgame. So I want to show you some data on sources a little more. This is back in 2011, Southern Minnesota. In 2012, we had a response at this site to nitrogen. And you can see we were using ESN because we thought, okay, we kind of let that go. We have a little bit more later in the season. Maybe we can bump the root growth, you know, and without hurting the quality. Well, ESN pre-plant, spring pre-plant compared to urea, no difference. We didn't get a nitrogen response at that site. This site, we got a response to urea, but not ESN. And over here, we got a response to N, but there's no difference in the source. So that kind of puts us to the fact, and we were below the optimum N rate in most of the sites, except for the ones that didn't respond. Now manure, that's a different story. It's got a longer mineralization. Different manures like turkey litter mineralizes a lot longer than say like swine manure. And swine manure, dairy, and poultry litter are a fact of life in our growing areas. Now, most of our growing is from, I'd say Buffalo Lake and west. There's a few fields that are east of Buffalo Lake, but we're in areas that are a little bit drier, and areas that these new dairies are coming in, and we've got a lot of manure from that. We've got swine operations, we get a lot of manure from that. And you get in the Wilmer area, there's turkey operations, and so we get a lot of litter from that. So where do we position the application of manure? Because it's just a fact, we have to deal with the manure. And so we set out to do a study. At the turn of the century, we did this study. I like using that term, it makes me feel young. Anyhow, we had treatments of a check with no N. Whoops, that didn't go as help. Check, fertilizer N of 40, 80, 120, and 160 and 200. Then we use liquid swine manure at 2.5 thousand gallons, or 2,500 gallons and 5,000 gallons per acre, and turkey litter at 2.5 tons and 5 tons per acre. Okay, now some of those rates on the swine manure at the time, people said, well, that's too low. We can't get our equipment that low. We have that research applicator. We were able to do that. Okay. So here's one thing about manure. You never know what you got till you got it applied. Okay. So you can see we can go anywhere from like here in turkey manure, 45 pounds to 153 pounds, 90 to 306, depending on where you got it from. Same way with the swine manure. So that's one of the problems they have with management of manure. Well, we put all this manure on right before, and this was on a field that never had a manure history. And we, in our minds, we were thinking, oh, what's going to happen here? Oh, we're going to have good tons, but we're not going to have any sugar in those beets because, you know, that it's mineralizing the whole season. And so we're not going to have sugar in the beets. Well, here's the yield data in extractable sucrose. And we have on this side of the line, by that I mean to your left-hand side, that's the fertilizer treatments. To the right-hand side, that's the manure treatments. Now, what we expected was all these fertilizer ones would be up here and then the manures would be down here because we hurt quality. We didn't see that. We actually increased yield enough to make up for the loss in the quality. And so right now what we're suggesting is okay, use it once in a 3-year rotation, either right before or right after the sugar beets when they're grown. And we're doing more work in this area. I've done a lot of work with hog manure. Melissa Wilson, we got her out there. We're working on dairy separated manure, and she's getting some similar results. I mean, I have 10 minutes left. Oh, there's no way in hell. Here we go. So I want to prove to you that the beets are a nitrogen pig. This is that same study. We went out and took 1 foot deep samples during the season, once a month. And you can see in the June sampling, basically the check was here and the 5,000 gallons of hog manure is here. Look what happened during the season. It all disappeared. All came down to the same. Where did it go? Well, probably went in the beets. They love it. Here's the residual nitrates, and that's a busy slide. So let's get a closer look at it. This is 2000, the turn of the century. You can see there's no difference statistically in that 0 to 4 foot depth. So beets are a nitrogen pig. I like calling them pigs. Okay, the right time. Now there's a couple points here. Fall versus spring pre-plant. And we know in corn that we'd rather have that spring pre-plant than put it on in the fall because it's out there available to the elements. For extractable sucrose, we did studies in the 2000s. We saw no difference between fall and spring. And so, you know, because of that root, I think it doesn't get away far enough that the beet root doesn't get to it. And we would prefer a spring pre-plant because of environmental chances, okay? So you say, well, what's some of our problems there? Well, if we have a spring pre-plant, I told you earlier that there's a plant stand problem. And this slide here shows you in 2 studies that we had out where we did the plant counts, that as N and fertilizer went up, stand went down. Happens that beets are pretty good compensators, but it's something to beware of. The other thing is so you said, John, you showed me this data from the turn of the century. This is a study Dan Kaiser put out in 2021, and this is showing spring versus fall application on sucrose. And you can see there's no difference. A little surprising to me because we've got more precipitation now than we did 20 some years ago. But that's what we're seeing. Now we got to do more. This year's plots had a little issue with them, so we couldn't use that data right now, but we're continuing on that. The right time, I told you about, you know, we don't think we need splits except for in sands, and we have a lot of data that would suggest that it's, unless you have an in-season operation where you can put N on, don't waste the money. Put it all on pre-plant. And this is a similar slide as what I showed with sources. And you can see that basically there's no differences. This is urea pre-plant and urea and a split that was put on almost July 1, a little late actually. There's no differences. Since I got 5 minutes now. Here's some data from 2019 and 2017 saying the same thing. So we feel pretty good about that recommendation. So in summary, Bruce is just going like this. He says, man, I don't have to wrestle him anymore. Okay, nitrogen management is important to profitable sugar production. I'd say it's important to other crops too. I'm not just saying that it's that. We want the right rate. We don't want too much on because we can actually hurt our product. We want to use the right form, and the secret to using the right form is you following the best management practices. And manure seems to increase the root yield more than what the loss in quality is at this time from our research, which I'm still shaking my head not believing, but it keeps coming up that way every time we do it. Manure research is not easy. It's a logistical nightmare. And so I'm so glad that Melissa came along to do that. The right time in heavy textured non-irrigated soils, pre-plant application in the fall or spring is good. I still like the spring because it leaves you more flexibility. In irrigated sandy soils, you must split it. It's superior. In the right place, it's not a huge factor on the placement, except for you don't want to put 28% on the seed. Duh. You got nothing if you put 20 gallons of UAN on the seed. And the urea in the spring, if you're going to put it on, work it in and plant like within a couple days. You got to be kind of careful about that. So I'm done. And I appreciate the chance I got to get outside of the metro area and burn some carbon. Oh, okay. What is the timing of mineralization of organic matter in sugar beet fields? Does it matter? Well, mineralization in sugar beet fields is much like mineralization in any of our other crop fields. It starts slow, and then when the soils warm up, it starts clunking along and starts doing a good job. Now, what we found when we looked at that study is a lot of the original mineralization started coming out like in June. And then as we got to the end, the beet started swallowing it up, and we didn't see as much, but you can see it's a significant factor. We've always had this question. Down in Nebraska, we always figured 30 pounds of N per percent organic matter, and we thought, well, with our colder soils, we don't know what it is. Looks like 20 might be a good one. And does it matter? Yes, it matters in sugar beets. If you got mineralization that's occurring late, particularly after you come out of a dry spell, you can hurt your quality. It won't hurt your corn. Corn doesn't care. It's done. Okay, what do we got here? Is rotation purely an N carryover effect, or are there other rotation factors? I believe there are. One, it's confounded, okay? Usually coming out of small grains, our nitrate is not quite as high for some reason, even though they aren't that deep rooted. But it's also the crop thing too. And those effects are hard to measure. It used to be following soybeans, we'd get a crunch because we'd get rhizoctonia. And you'd have a perfect stand one week and you'd go out there the next week and it was all gone. But we've gotten some fungicides like Quadris that we can put on, and the right timing of that is taking that away, and actually following soybeans isn't too bad. One of the worst crops to follow, believe it or not, other than alfalfa, is field corn. And in the southern Minnesota beet grower area, about 70% of the beets are follow corn. Okay,